So when we talk about the concept of joy, it's so quickly attached to being happy, but yet we want to challenge that joy is more attached to wholeness, and there is a way for us to stand and know that we are whole and thereby practice joy. That and a little bit more in today's episode.
Today's episode is brought to you by Logos. Learn more about the world's best Bible study software at logos.com/themove. Today we're looking at John chapter 3, verses 21 to 36.
And as always, the question is, have you read it? If you haven't, it's in the description below. With that, we will put 10 minutes on the clock and we will get started in 3, 2, 1, go. So, go ahead, man.
One thing that I was reading in this passage is really the secret to joy in life.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us, we believe this fairy tale, and maybe it's not completely a fairy tale, but the way that I've believed it has been a fairy tale, that with life with Jesus is always better. It's always good. There's no bad thing. It's going to be rainbows and sunshine, butterflies and unicorns, or whatever the case is, right? Life is great with Jesus. And there's a real sense in which life is great with Jesus. And I think that there's a place where we can get to, like Paul, who says, hey, I know how to be content in every situation that I'm in. And yet, there's a challenge at times to experiencing true fulfillment, true joy, and just a really dope existence. Life abundant is what Jesus talks about. Yeah. So in this passage, I see a really cool kind of like key to unlocking this. And we see this in the example of John. This passage talks about John the Baptist and Jesus doing something. Incidentally, this is the only passage in the Gospels where Jesus is mentioned as having to do with baptism.
Really?
Yeah, that's what I was at least according to this commentary that I was reading, says that that's the only one that says it.
Okay.
But we see here that it's actually what happens is that Jesus tells his disciples to baptize on his behalf.
Yep.
So anywho, John the Baptist is over here baptizing. People are coming every single day because his word's getting around. Some amazing things are happening. Jesus is over maybe in not too far a place, and he's also baptizing. Some of John's disciples notice what's going on, and they, hey, John, look over there. Did you see what's happening? Yeah. And it's almost like they're inviting some type of controversy.
Contrast, comparison. Right?
And isn't that really one of the major roots to being unhappy in life?
Yeah. Comparison is a dangerous game, right? Stephen Covey calls it one of the deadly cancers, one of the emotional cancers, which is comparison, right? To compare yourself to another, right? Because one of the things that you do when you compare, or not always, but in the general sense, is that you always highlight the best of another by seeing the worst possible outcome for yourself.
Yeah, isn't that weird? How I match my low points with your high points. It's like, man, you did really good at that one time. Yeah. And that one time I screwed up, and that's what we compare against.
Yeah. Something that strikes me about this passage is that, yes, this thing of comparison that ends up happening, but John's response
is so cool, whatever.
Because there's a sense in where John, for where we are in the story, John has an understanding of his role, right? He has an understanding of his purpose. He has seen his role and purpose come to fulfillment, right? I mean, his whole life has been one leading up to the work that he's been doing. Yeah, it's been prophesied from beginning, from his life, and he's actually now seeing it come to fruition.
So John doesn't take the bait.
Yes.
John's like, hey, listen, a person can't receive even one thing unless it's given to him from heaven. He has this bigger picture on reality, that life isn't really about what you work up and can get and attain for yourself at the expense of someone else. He realizes that it's all under the domain of God, and that in a certain respect, everything that happens is because of what God has allowed to happen.
And I love how he correctly positions himself, right? Where he calls himself the friend of the bridegroom.
Yeah.
Right? And he also talks about the difference between him being from above, us being from below. He's from heaven, we're from earth, right? So that correctly positioning himself and seeing that as the role that he played on an earthly level has ushered in this person that actually emerges from the heavenly realm, that he correctly sees himself in light of what's happening, so that he concludes with saying, I must decrease and he must increase. And in that decreasing, he actually finds wholeness, joy,
happiness.
Yeah.
I read something that was really interesting, that there's good evidence that an ancient Sumerian and Babylonian law said that the best man was prohibited from ever marrying the bride. So say that the husband dies.
Yeah.
there's one person on the face of the planet that is legally not allowed to marry the bride or the widow, and it's the best man.
Wow.
And we see this kind of playing out even in Samson. Samson gets married, he goes off for a little bit, his bride gets married to his best man.
Yeah, and he is hot.
Yeah, he's getting pissed.
Yeah.
So it's this idea, is like he knows who he is. He knows, like, listen, that praise, that adoration never was intended for me. It does not belong to me. And so because I recognize this, and because I've accepted the identity that God has given me as the best man, right? In this example, he's like, I don't have to feel stressed when the he gets the girl. Like, I'm happy for him. Yeah, it's awesome.
That's super good. So something that struck me about when you talked about something you said struck the chord for me about wholeness. And joy. Did you say wholeness earlier? But it struck.
Sometimes I'm not even sure what I'm saying.
All right, well, it struck. I have that same problem.
Yeah.
But it struck for me, this idea of holiness versus, or wholeness, not holiness, but wholeness versus happiness. That there's an invitation in the moment for John to pursue
wholeness or happiness.
Wholeness or happiness, and especially in that point of comparison, like, are you living your best life right now if this thing is being kept from you?
Right. There's this idea that happiness is this thing that you need this and this and this in order to be happy, right? But what we're saying is that happiness in many times is kind of a deception. Yeah. At least the way that people advertise happiness, the way that you see it on Instagram or YouTube or whatever the case is.
And John is saying, listen, no. I know my role. I know who I am. And there's a certain wholeness in where I'm at, right? And then I love how the text actually concludes, because this was something that's very pivotal for me. And I want to come back to the wholeness bit. Okay. But he says, say from verse 31 on, where he who comes from above is above all. This is John speaking from this overflow of knowing his role. He who is of the earth belongs to the earth and speaks in an earthly way. He knows his positioning. He who comes from heaven is above all. He bears witness to what he has seen and heard. John's recognized, I haven't seen and heard that. Like, I know what I saw and heard, and it was to give way to him because of what he's seen and heard. How dope would it be if we lived lives where we actually gave priority of place to people who had the talents and skills that we recognize we don't have, but that doesn't actually take away from us.
Yeah, that's good.
So, but to keep going, right? Verse 34, for he whom God has sent utters the words of God, for he gives the Spirit without measure. Wow. And particularly, he gives the Spirit without measure, not only to others, because he's going to baptize with the Spirit, right? But he also has the Spirit without measure.
Yeah, like the application is more directly that Jesus is the one who has the Spirit without measure. That every prophet, every person who's ever came, had the Spirit, but there's a portion in which it's not complete, even to the extent that someone could pray, hey, give me a double portion of the Spirit that guy had.
Yes.
And yet now Jesus has without.
And isn't that interesting that you just referenced Elisha, who in response to Elijah wants a double portion of what Elijah has. John is the Elijah, and what follows after is he who has the fullness of the Spirit, right? Yeah. But he has fullness even more so, right?
Wow. Okay, very good.
But then verse 35, the Father loves the Son, giving all things into his hand. And this, whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not, and then this word obey the Son shall not see life. And how do we receive that? Often we've received that as you have to obey, you have to comply.
You got to do.
You got to do.
And not do.
Right? But what is it? It's actually, again, believing, right? It's that same word of believing. And what is it? To receive the truth that God has spoken, to know your standing in relationship. And in that is where you actually find the wholeness that life brings, right? I want to draw attention to this quote as we have a minute and a half. This is by Hugh McKay. And he actually, I'll summarize it, but he says, I actually attack the concept of happiness, the idea that I don't mind people being happy, but the idea that everything we do is in part pursuit of happiness seems to be a dangerous idea and has led to a contemporary disease in Western society, which fears sadness. It's a real odd thing that we're now seeing people say, write 3 things that'll make you go happy before you go to sleep, right? And he's like, it's rubbish. Wholeness is what we ought to be striving for. And part of that sadness, disappointment, frustration, failure, all these things which make us who we are, happiness, victory, and fulfillment are nice little things that also happen, but they don't teach us as much. Everyone says we go through pain, and then as soon as they experience pain, they say, quick, move on, cheer up. I'd like to say for a year to have a moratorium on the word happy and replace it with the word wholeness, and ask yourself, is this contributing to my wholeness? And if you're having a bad day, it is. Right?
Wow. So that even in a bad day, even in a season that's low, I could actually be experiencing all that God has intended for me to experience at that time. I could actually be becoming a more whole version of myself, becoming truly human in that respect, being all that Jesus has wanted me to be. And because I'm not focused on happiness,
wholeness. And I draw attention to this quote precisely because of where John will end up. John sees himself in relationship to Jesus. Right now, he's standing in wholeness, even as he's decreasing and Jesus is increasing. And he's going to be challenged to return back to this very place, in a situation and circumstance where he can't really be happy. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But that wholeness and all of this happens as you stand in correct relationship to Jesus. Oh, there we go.
You're making an allusion to something, and I'm skipping forward because I don't think in John it refers to the actual end of John where he's going to.
Oh, in the book of John doesn't talk about it?
It doesn't seem like it. The giving it away, I don't think it's because chapter 4 goes to the woman in Samaria.
Oh, yeah.
So we move forward. He gives allusion at the beginning of this chunk that we just read that John had not yet been put in prison.
Yeah.
The whole end of where John leads is that he actually ends up getting beheaded.
Yeah.
And yet, he has wholeness.
Yeah.
He has joy. He has peace and life.
And when he gets beheaded, remember that he gets beheaded, and before he gets beheaded, he's imprisoned. He sends disciples of his to go ask Jesus, "Are you really truly the one?" So he's actually it's seemingly backtracking or having some questions about whether or not his life and his mission was worth anything. Does this sum up to what I thought it summed up to? Jesus does not affirm him and saying, "Yes, I am." What does he do? He says, "Well, come watch for a while." He heals many. He does miraculous works. And then he says, "Go back and tell John what you've seen," right? That you've seen the blind see, the lame walk again, right? And good news has been preached to the poor, right? Good news has been preached to, go tell them. And as you go tell them, again, that reaffirms the revelation of Jesus, reaffirms in him the place where he comes under the belief and the obedience of faith that actually makes him whole. That's the point.
So if we can summarize, the key to joy, the key to happiness actually is really abandoning the idea of happiness and seeking wholeness, because you are affirming you're affirming yourself by accepting the identity that God has placed on you and realizing he is who he says he is.
Yeah, good stuff.
There you go. Hey movers, I recently got to travel to the Logos headquarters and ended up recording several tutorials on how you and I can get more from our Bible study using Logos. To see the entire playlist of videos, visit logos.com/themove and get 10% off any Logos 8 product you want. logos.com/themove.